The chamber had gone quiet in a way that Counselor Vane Sarrett had never heard before. Not silent, quiet. There was a difference, and in 43 years of serving on the Galactic Deliberative Assembly, Vane Sarrett had learned to feel it in the membranes beneath her secondary eyelids, that particular stillness that settled over a room when something had already happened that no one yet understood. The human delegate's chair was empty. It had been empty for 6 minutes. The vote had passed 4 minutes ago. The margin was decisive. 217 member civilizations in favor of the disarmament resolution, 11 abstaining, and humanity, alone, singular, statistically insignificant, casting the only dissenting vote before their single representative stood, straightened his jacket in that peculiar human way that always looked like a kind of ceremony, and walked out of the chamber without a word. Ambassador Elias Cord had not looked angry. That was the part that bothered Vane Sarrett. She had prepared herself for anger. She had run scenarios with her advisory staff, had consulted 3 separate behavioral modeling institutes, had even spoken privately with the 2 human academic liaisons attached to the Assembly's cultural exchange program. Every model, every consultation, every piece of behavioral literature had suggested the same outcome. Humans, when stripped of the tools they considered central to their identity, would react with what their own literature called righteous fury. They would shout. They would make speeches. They would invoke historical precedents and moral arguments in that particular human style that started from an emotional premise and built outward like a structure with no blueprint, arriving at conclusions that somehow felt both irrational and difficult to argue against. Elias Cord had done none of those things. He had simply left, and for reasons she couldn't immediately articulate, that was so much worse. The resolution itself was not unusual in the context of galactic governance. The Deliberative Assembly had enacted similar measures before. The Vorath Reduction Accords of 1200 cycles passed, the Neth Containment Protocol. When a species demonstrated patterns of escalating military development that exceeded the calculated defensive threshold by more than 3 standard deviations, the Assembly had both the authority and, in the view of 217 civilizations, the obligation to act. Humanity's weapons development programs had exceeded that threshold by 11 standard deviations. 11. The number had appeared in the proposal document and briefly paralyzed 3 of the Assembly's own analytical systems, which had initially returned an error code, because the deviation was so far outside modeled parameters that the software had assumed the data was corrupted. It wasn't corrupted. That was the first thing everyone had needed to come to terms with. The resolution was simple in structure. Humanity would surrender its classified weapons development programs to international monitoring teams within 90 cycles, dismantle active military research installations, and submit all existing weapons systems above Class 7 designation to assembly inspection and regulated storage. In return, humanity would retain full membership in the Assembly, continue to receive trade protections, and would not face the punitive isolation measures that had historically accompanied the reduction accords. The Assembly had decided generous. It was, Vane Sarrett had privately believed, the most difficult negotiation they would ever conduct. What she had not anticipated was that there would be no negotiation at all. Elias Cord had listened to the full presentation. He had asked 2 questions, both procedural, both calm, and then he had voted no, and then he had left, and now the chamber was quiet in that particular way, and Vane Sarrett was standing at the edge of the delegate floor trying to understand what she was feeling, and the only word she could find for it was waiting. The galaxy was waiting, and it didn't know what it was waiting for. The first monitoring team arrived at the human facility on Kepler Station 7 weeks later. The team was led by a Dravari administrator named Sas Ev, a methodical and well-regarded professional who had overseen 3 previous reduction accord implementations without incident. She had reviewed the human facility schematics, studied the cultural briefing documents provided by the Assembly's Xenological Department, and had spoken to her team at length about the importance of treating the process with dignity and respect for human sensitivities. She had expected resistance. Procedural resistance, delays, documentation disputes, the kind of bureaucratic friction that species almost always generated when they felt their sovereignty was being encroached upon. What she found was a staff of 43 humans who were entirely cooperative, completely immediately, almost disturbingly cooperative. They had prepared documentation she hadn't asked for. They had organized storage systems for the surrendered equipment that exceeded her team's own protocols for orderliness. The facility director, a woman named Dr. Preeta Voss, had greeted Sas Eth with coffee, the human beverage that every xenological brief mentioned as a social ritual, and had provided a guided tour of every room without waiting to be asked. Every room, including several that weren't on the schematics Sas Eth had been given. That was the first thing that didn't fit. These rooms were not in the documentation submitted to the assembly, Sas Eth said, standing in a corridor that the schematics had represented as a wall. Dr. Voss nodded. I know. I wanted you to see them anyway. What are they? Storage, Dr. Voss said, and there was something in the way she said it, flat, precise, without the upward inflection that humans typically used when they wanted a statement to feel casual, that made Sas Eth's environmental sensors register a 2-degree drop in her own body temperature. A stress response. The first one she'd had since arriving. Storage for what? Things were not required to surrender, Dr. Voss said, and smiled. And Sas Eth spent the next 3 weeks trying to understand whether that smile had been friendly or not, and remained uncertain. The facility was surrendered on schedule. The documentation was immaculate. Sas Eth filed her report and marked the implementation as proceeding normally, but she added a notation at the end, a single paragraph that her supervisors would later describe as vague and somewhat alarmist. The notation read, "The humans understood the resolution's requirements completely and in full detail. I believe they understood it better than we did when we wrote it." Elias Cord's office in the Assembly's Human Liaison Complex was smaller than his rank technically warranted. He had been offered the standard delegate suite, the one with the view of the orbital garden, the one with furniture calibrated to human proportions and atmospheric settings adjusted to human comfort parameters, and he had taken the smaller room on the interior of the building. No view, no garden. The furniture was whatever had been left behind by the previous occupant, a Keth diplomat who stood roughly twice Elias' height and preferred to sleep horizontally on a shelf. He had not complained about the furniture. His assistant, a young woman named Mara Chen, who had the specific and unusual quality of appearing to think faster than she spoke, had asked him once why he'd taken the smaller room. "Windows can be monitored," he said. "So can interior rooms," she said. "Yes," he said, "but interior rooms don't show what you're looking at." Mara had written that down. She wrote things down in a paper notebook, which attracted a surprising amount of alien attention, since paper was considered either a primitive medium or a deliberate affectation, and most assembly members couldn't decide which interpretation made them more uncomfortable. Mara used it because, as she'd explained to Vane Sarat's cultural attaché during a reception 18 months earlier, paper cannot be remotely accessed. The cultural attaché had filed a report about it. The report was 3 pages long and concluded with a recommendation for further study. The follow-up study had been commissioned and had been ongoing for 14 months when Mara Chen's notebook became relevant to events in a way that no one had anticipated. Elias Cord spent the weeks following the vote attending every public session of the Assembly. He attended committee meetings. He attended the cultural exchange presentations. He attended the quarterly infrastructure review, which was generally so tedious that 3 assembly members had reportedly entered voluntary metabolic dormancy during a previous session. He sat in the same seat. He listened. He did not speak unless directly addressed. He took no notes that anyone could observe. The Behavioral Modeling Institutes revised their projections twice during this period. The first revision concluded that Cord was in a state of passive resistance, performing compliance while waiting for a political opportunity to challenge the resolution. The second revision, issued 12 days later, quietly walked back several of the first revision's core assumptions and concluded that the modeling was insufficient because the inputs were insufficient. What the models couldn't account for was the thing that Vane Sarrett noticed at the 43rd session Cord attended, sitting in his customary seat, listening with his customary attention. She noticed it because she had started watching him, not strategically, not analytically, but in the way you watch something when your instincts tell you it matters and you don't yet know why. He was never surprised, not once, not by a single piece of information presented in any session. He would sometimes nod. He would sometimes write something with one of those ink-based instruments humans used on paper, in a journal that no one had been able to examine because he carried it in an interior pocket of his jacket and apparently never put the jacket somewhere unattended. But he was never surprised. Vane Sarrett began to wonder what would surprise him, and then she began to wonder if the answer was nothing. And then she began to wonder if that was because he already knew what was going to happen. And then she started asking questions that she wished, 4 months later, she had thought of much sooner. The crisis began, and the word began is doing significant work here, because later analysis would suggest it had actually begun long before anyone recognized it, on a Tuesday in the human calendar system, which the assembly used for administrative scheduling purely, because it had more subdivisions than most alternatives, and therefore created fewer rounding errors. A Neth patrol vessel in the outer transit corridor detected an anomalous energy signature from the direction of the Helios relay cluster. This was not unusual in itself. The Helios cluster was old infrastructure with regular fluctuations. What was unusual was the signature's specific frequency, which matched no known natural phenomenon and no cataloged artificial source. The patrol vessel logged it and moved on, as patrol vessels do. 2 days later, a completely different type of anomaly was detected by a Drivari sensor array in a system roughly 40 light-years away, a localized distortion in the subspace frequency band that the assembly's communication networks used as a foundation layer. Not a disruption, not interference, just a distortion, like something had passed through and left a wake. That was also logged. The maintenance teams were notified. On the 6th day, Mara Chen knocked on Elias Cord's door at 4 in the morning, Assembly Standard Time, which corresponded to approximately 3 in the morning by her own personal biological preference, which meant she had been awake for some time before she knocked. She was carrying her paper notebook and a tablet with a screen turned away from the corridor's ambient monitoring system, which meant she had thought about the angle of the screen before approaching. Cord opened the door before she knocked a second time. "Helios cluster," she said. "Yes," he said. "You knew." He looked at her for a moment, a specifically human kind of look, the kind that wasn't expressionless but also wasn't any single expression, the kind that contained several things simultaneously. "I didn't know," he said. "I expected." "There's a difference, a significant one," he said. "Come in." What Mara showed him was not the Helios signature or the Drivari distortion in isolation. It was a pattern. She had been tracking smaller anomalies, individually unremarkable, collectively coherent, across 7 different monitoring systems for 3 weeks. She had been doing it by hand, in the paper notebook, cross-referencing against public assembly infrastructure logs that were technically available to any assembly member but were so voluminous and technical that no one ever actually read them in full. Mara had read them in full. The pattern wasn't a weapon. It wasn't an attack. It was something Cord had no word for in any language he spoke fluently, and he spoke 9. It was the absence of something that should have been present, like a shape defined not by its contents but by the empty space around it. "Someone is removing relays," Mara said. "Not destroying them, removing them, physically. The infrastructure is disappearing." "How much?" Cord asked. Mara looked at her notebook for a moment. Based on the distortion patterns, roughly 6% of the outer transit corridor network. Cord was quiet for a long time, not the silence of someone thinking, the silence of someone who had been thinking for weeks and had just arrived at the last step. "They'll notice in about 3 days," he said, "when they run the quarterly maintenance diagnostic. And when they do, they'll look for a culprit." He paused. "They'll find evidence." "Evidence of what?" He looked at her again with that not quite expressionless expression. "Of whatever they're most afraid of." Mara sat with that for a moment. "Cord," she said, "did humans do this?" The pause before he answered was exactly long enough to make the answer itself almost irrelevant. "No," he said, but someone wants the assembly to believe we did. The quarterly maintenance diagnostic ran 2 days earlier than scheduled because a Keth engineering crew happened to be running a calibration sweep in the outer corridor and noticed a discrepancy that flagged automatically. The diagnostic confirmed what Mara had already mapped. 6.3% of outer transit infrastructure had been removed. Not damaged, not malfunctioning. Gone. The investigation team was assembled within 48 hours. It was one of the fastest institutional responses in assembly history, which Vane Sarrett noted in her private journal, and then noted again that she had noted it, which meant something was making her nervous enough to document her own mental state. The investigation ran for 11 days before the lead analyst presented preliminary findings. The findings included a complete technical analysis, a timeline of the disappearances, and a collection of subspace trace evidence that, when interpreted through standard forensic protocols, pointed in a single consistent direction, toward human-controlled space. The chamber went quiet in the way it had gone quiet after the vote, and Vane Sarrett felt it again in her secondary eyelids, and she found herself watching Elias Cord's face across the delegate floor. He was not surprised. He was not angry. He was watching the chamber the way she had been watching him, with complete attention, waiting for something specific. And when the lead analyst finished the presentation and opened the floor for response, Cord raised his hand in that distinctly human gesture he used when he wanted to be called upon, and Vane Sarrett felt something she would later describe in her memoirs as dread arriving early, which was not a phrase in her native language but felt necessary to invent. Ambassador Cord, the assembly chair acknowledged. "Thank you," Cord said. He stood, he straightened his jacket. "I'd like to ask who commissioned the analysis of the trace evidence." A pause. The analysis was conducted by the Assembly's Forensic Technical Division, and the interpretive protocols they used, which version, another pause longer, version 7.2 of the Subspace Forensic Standard. "I see," Cord said. He didn't sit. And the Technical Division is aware that version 7.2 was developed primarily using data from transit infrastructure in the inner corridor systems, where human ship traffic is negligible, and therefore doesn't account for several specific harmonic signatures that are artifacts of our propulsion technology rather than indicators of intentional manipulation. Silence. "I'd be happy to provide the technical documentation," Cord said. "We submitted it to the Assembly's Technical Standards Committee 18 months ago. I believe it's still in review." He sat down. He opened his journal and wrote something in it. The investigation was suspended pending technical review. The lead analyst requested a full ray analysis. 3 members of the Forensic Technical Division asked to review the human propulsion documentation, which did exist, exactly as Cord had described, filed 18 months ago, sitting in a review queue that had grown to 9,000 items because the Technical Standards Committee was chronically understaffed. Mara was the one who had filed it. She had filed it knowing it would sit unread. She had filed it knowing it would matter later. The question that no one in the investigation was yet asking, the question that was sitting in the quiet of the chamber like something with weight, was not whether humans had taken the infrastructure. It was why someone else had taken it and arranged the evidence to point at humans, and whether whoever had done that had known about the propulsion documentation, and whether they had also known it would sit unreviewed, and whether that meant they knew something specific about how the assembly functioned from the inside. Vane Sarrett wrote 7 words in her private journal that night and then sat looking at them for an hour. They were waiting for us to misread it. The second monitoring team's report arrived 6 weeks after the first. It had been commissioned as a routine follow-up, standard practice after initial implementation, and it covered 42 human facilities across 6 systems. Sas Eth was not on this team. She had been reassigned to the infrastructure investigation. The second team was led by a Neth administrator named Vel Torin, who had a reputation for thoroughness and a personal philosophy centered on what he called empirical patience, meaning he believed in observing before concluding. His report was 79 pages long. The first 60 pages were routine. Facilities were in compliance. Documentation was accurate. Equipment was surrendered in good condition. Human staff continued to exhibit the cooperative but slightly wrong behavior that Sas Eth had noted, but Veltorin documented it with more precision. The humans were cooperative in a specific way. They answered every question accurately. They provided access to every area requested. They never interfered with inspections. They also never volunteered information about anything that hadn't been specifically requested. This was technically compliant. This was also, Veltorin wrote in a footnote on page 61, like speaking to someone who was choosing each word with extraordinary care, like watching someone navigate a very specific and invisible set of rules. Pages 61 through 79 documented 17 separate instances in which the monitoring team had asked questions about facilities or programs, received accurate and complete answers, and then later, sometimes much later, realized that the accurate and complete answer had not addressed what the question was actually about. The example that Veltorin spent the most time on was this. His team had asked the director of a human research facility on Titan whether the facility contained any ongoing weapons research programs subject to the resolution's requirements. The director had said no. This was true. The facility contained no weapons research programs. The facility contained a materials science program focused on thermal conductivity in high-pressure environments. It contained an atmospheric chemistry program. It contained a computational modeling division that was working on what the documentation described as optimized resource allocation for complex system management. Veltorin had accepted all of this at face value. His team had accepted it. The report had been submitted. Then, on the journey back to the assembly, a member of his team, a young Drevari analyst named Tev Saln, who had grown up near a human trade colony and had therefore spent more time around humans than almost anyone else on the team, had said something quietly during a meal that had caused Veltorin to stop eating mid-bite. "The thermal conductivity research," Tev Saln said. "What surface are they modeling it on?" Veltorin had looked up. "Reactive surfaces," Tev Saln said. "I saw the materials list. They're modeling heat transfer across reactive surfaces under extreme pressure. That's not an infrastructure application. She stopped. That's what you need to know when you're designing something that has to survive being fired." Veltorin's report included a recommendation for a full secondary investigation of 17 human facilities. He also included, in a separate sealed appendix that he delivered personally to the assembly chair rather than submitting through normal channels, a 9-page analysis titled Definitional Compliance and its relationship to substantive compliance, a concern regarding human implementation. The appendix's central thesis was simple and deeply uncomfortable. The humans had not violated the resolution's requirements, because they had understood the resolution's requirements with more precision than the assembly had when writing them. They had found the spaces between the words, and whatever was living in those spaces had not been surrendered. Vane Sarrett requested a private meeting with Ambassador Cord 3 days after Veltorin's report crossed her desk, through an unofficial channel, via a written note delivered by a courier who was not on the assembly's staff directory, because she had thought about the Windows comment and decided to apply the principle more broadly. Cord received her in his small, windowless office. He had made coffee, which she had never tried before and which she accepted because refusing it felt like refusing something she couldn't afford to misunderstand. "I have read 47 reports about human behavior in the last 8 weeks, she said. "I know," Cord said. "I requested copies of the forwarding logs from records management, procedural right of the subject party." "Of course you did," she looked at her cup. "The coffee is bitter," he said. "The first cup usually is." "You acclimate," she set it down. "Ambassador Cord, I'd like to ask you something directly." "I'll answer directly if I can," he said. "What are humans planning?" He looked at her, the not quite expressionless expression. "I'm not certain I know what you mean." "The compliance," she said. "It's too perfect. Tev Saln's analysis, which I know you've also seen." "I haven't seen Tev Saln's analysis specifically," he said. "I've reached similar conclusions through different methods." "You expected the forensic trace evidence to point at human space." He was quiet. "You expected the infrastructure disappearances," she said. You expected the facilities to be compliant in a way that wouldn't hold up to secondary analysis. You expected all of it, and you came to this meeting because she stopped. Why did you come to this meeting? You asked, he said, and I wanted to have this conversation. Why? He looked at his coffee. Because in 6 weeks the assembly is going to face a decision, and I want there to be at least one person in the assembly who has heard what I'm about to tell you before they have to make it. The dread arrived again, early and heavy. What decision? The infrastructure that was removed, he said. Someone took it. Not humans, you know that now, or your forensic team will confirm it within the week. But whoever took it didn't take it to inconvenience transit. Outer corridor infrastructure is not critical for internal assembly function. It's critical for something else. Early warning, she said slowly. The outer corridor relay network is the assembly's primary early detection system for extragalactic intrusion events. Without 6% of it, there are 18 blind spots of varying size in the monitoring coverage. He paused. Someone created 18 blind spots. And then they arranged evidence to ensure that when the assembly investigated, the investigation would take months and involve humanity as the prime suspect. Vane Sarrett felt something shift, the cold feeling you get when a room changes temperature and you realize you don't know where the draft is coming from. What's in the blind spots? I don't know, Cord said, but I've been trying to find out for 4 months. And here's what concerns me more than not knowing. I think whoever did this knows that I've been trying to find out, and I think they're not particularly worried about it. Why not? He picked up his coffee. Because they don't think humans can do anything that matters anymore, he said. The resolution worked. That's the part everyone is missing. The resolution worked exactly as designed. Human firepower is surrendered, monitored, contained. We are, by every metric the assembly uses, reduced. Whatever is in those blind spots, whoever arranged all of this, they did it specifically because they calculated that with human weapons capability removed, there was no longer any meaningful opposition to what comes next. Vane Sarrett stared at him. I voted against the resolution, Cord said, not because humans need weapons to feel powerful. I voted against it because someone else needed us disarmed before they could proceed, and we were disarmed on schedule. The room was quiet. Not the assembly's kind of quiet, something smaller and more personal and in its way worse. You knew this would happen, she said, before the vote. I suspected, I prepared for the possibility. Then why? She stopped, restarted. What did you prepare? He was quiet for a long moment. He was choosing words. She could see it the way Veltorin had described watching humans navigate invisible rules. And she understood suddenly that she was the one being answered accurately and completely without necessarily being told what the question was about. Enough, he said finally. I prepared enough. Enough for what? He looked at her. And then he said something that she would write in her private journal that night and then read every morning for the next 6 weeks. Enough to make it matter that we chose to. The forensic ray analysis confirmed Cord's assessment 11 days later. The trace evidence pointing at human space was an artifact of version 7.2's interpretive limitations, not a genuine indicator of human involvement. The investigation pivoted. New evidence emerged. The actual origin of the removal operations pointed toward a class of vessel that no assembly member had registered, flagged, or in most cases considered, because it was a class that shouldn't exist. A design that predated any current assembly civilization's spacefaring history by approximately 3,000 years and had been classified in assembly records as presumed extinct. Presumed. The chamber went very quiet when that word was said aloud, different from the other kinds of quiet. This one had a texture to it, a density, that Vane Sarrett felt not in her secondary eyelids but somewhere more central. The assembly had a word for civilizations that were presumed extinct, concluded. It was a gentle word, a bureaucratic word. It implied a kind of dignity, a natural ending. It did not imply that concluded civilizations might later have opinions about the galaxy that had concluded them. Elias Cord sat in his seat and did not look surprised. The first contact event, which was not a first contact, which was precisely the problem, occurred 42 days later. Three vessels of the ancient and supposedly concluded design materialized simultaneously at points that corresponded precisely to the largest of the blind spots in the outer relay network. They broadcast a signal. The signal took 9 days to fully translate because it was encoded in a linguistic structure that matched nothing in the assembly's archives, and the only reason it was eventually translated at all was because Mara Chen had spent 3 years studying pre-assembly linguistic archaeology as something her personnel file described as a personal interest. Her personnel file had been reviewed by Assembly Security Services when she joined CORD's staff. The notation had read, "Unusual hobby, no security concern." The message, once translated, was 11 words in the Assembly's most common trade language. 11 words that had been chosen, Mara noted in the margin of her translation document in her paper notebook, with very specific precision. Your protectors are disarmed. You were told this would be acceptable. The Assembly session that followed was the longest in recorded history. It ran for 9 days without recess. Species argued, pleaded, proposed, countermanded, allied, fractured, realigned, and panicked in patterns that the behavioral models were entirely unprepared to map. Several civilizations immediately proposed rearming humanity, and then immediately reversed position when other civilizations objected. 3 civilizations proposed surrendering their own weapons to the Assembly's collective management in solidarity, and then were voted down. 2 civilizations sent private communications to Elia's cord that were not disclosed through official channels, which was technically a violation of Assembly communication protocols, which neither civilization mentioned. Cord attended every minute of the 9 days. He sat in his seat. He listened. He did not speak. On the 9th day, when the session had deteriorated to the point that the chair had called 3 separate procedural recesses, and the Behavioral Modeling Institutes had revised their projections 4 times, and each revision was more uncertain than the last, Vane Sarat stood. She had not planned to speak. She had a speech prepared, had been preparing it for 6 days, but when she stood, she found she wasn't going to give it. Because she had been watching Cord for 9 days and she had understood something that the speech didn't capture. "Ambassador Cord," she said. He looked at her. "You have not spoken." "No," he said. "You've been waiting." Yes, the chamber was listening. 217 civilizations, their delegates, their aides, their advisory staff, the monitoring systems, the behavioral modeling institutes receiving the live feed. "What have you been waiting for?" she asked. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his journal. "For the Assembly to run out of options it was comfortable with," he said, "so it would be prepared to hear about the ones it wasn't." He spoke for 4 hours. He used no visual aids. He used no documents. He spoke from the journal, from 4 months of handwritten notes in a book that could not be remotely accessed, assembled from 47 monitoring team reports, 43 assembly sessions, the public infrastructure logs, the Drevari sensor array data, Mara's pattern analysis, Vel Torren's appendix, 12 private communications, and what he called, simply, pattern recognition. He told them what the concluded civilization wanted. He told them why the timing of the resolution had not been coincidence. He told them what the blind spots were for, and what would come through them, and when, and by what route. He told them all of this with the specificity and certainty of someone reading from a map rather than guessing at a territory. And the chamber was quiet in a new way, a way that Vane Sarat had no category for, something beyond all the previous kinds of quiet, something that was silence and attention, and a particular quality of collective fear that felt less like panic and more like the moment before a diagnosis is confirmed. When he finished, the chair asked the question that everyone was thinking. "How do we respond?" Cord looked at his journal. He turned 1 page. "The resolution surrendered human weapons above Class 7 designation," he said. Class 7 is defined in Assembly Resolution 1244 as any weapons system capable of inflicting strategic-level damage across a zone exceeding 500 kilometers. He looked up. The definition was written in the context of planetary conflict modeling. It wasn't written to account for certain other categories of capability. What categories? The chair said. The humans who built the weapons you regulated, Cord said slowly, also built the people who understood why they were built. He paused. You disarmed us. You didn't, he stopped. Seemed to consider the next word very carefully. You didn't uneducate us. The chamber was processing this. Vane Sarat could see it happening across 217 faces, in 217 different ways, the same realization arriving at different speeds. The materials science program, someone said, a Drivari delegate, the thermal conductivity research. Compliant with the resolution, Cord said, yes. The computational modeling, someone else said, Keth, resource allocation for complex systems. Also compliant. You've been, the Keth delegate stopped. Started again. You've been rebuilding in the space between. We've been maintaining competency, Cord said. The resolution removed our weapons. It did not remove our capacity to think about what weapons are for. He closed the journal. We didn't violate your resolution. We respected its exact language, which was what you were entitled to require, and which was all you required because you wrote a document about objects and not about the knowledge that makes objects meaningful. He looked at Vane Sarat just for a moment. We found the spaces between the words. What followed was not a battle. This is important. It would be recorded as a campaign which was accurate, but the word battle implies a kind of symmetry, two forces of comparable type meeting in comparable terms, and what happened was nothing like that. Humanity had no Class 7 weapons. Humanity had no military vessels. Humanity had, in full compliance with the resolution, surrendered every item that met every definition the Assembly had provided. What humanity had was Mara Chen's 3-year linguistic study of pre-assembly civilizations, applied to a communication strategy that exploited 17 specific structural weaknesses in the concluded civilization's own signal encoding, weaknesses that Mara had identified, and that no one else in the galaxy had thought to look for, because no one else had considered the concluded civilization a subject worth studying in depth. What humanity had was 4 months of Dr. Preeta Voss's thermal conductivity research, which was exactly what Tev Saln had suspected, and exactly what the Assembly couldn't prove without triggering a political confrontation they hadn't been ready for, applied to a guidance system for a device that, technically, generated no explosive yield, and therefore met no Assembly definition of a weapon. What humanity had was Cord's 4 months of pattern analysis, which turned out to be not just a diagnostic but a model, a complete operational model of the concluded civilization's tactical logic, built from indirect evidence, from absences and distortions, and the specific shape of things that were missing. And what humanity had, underneath all of it, was the thing that Vane Sarat had been trying to name since the vote, the thing in the quiet of the chamber, the thing in Cord's not quite expressionless face, the thing that the behavioral models had returned error codes trying to quantify. Humans had kept working. Through the vote, through the disarmament, through the investigation, through 9 days of assembly paralysis, through every moment when any rational calculation said that the situation was beyond recovery, they had kept working. Not because they were certain they could succeed, not because the odds were acceptable, but because stopping was not something they were built to do. The concluded civilization's vessels came through the blind spots on the predicted schedule. There were 7 of them. They were enormous, ancient in design but clearly maintained, clearly operational, clearly built by minds that had spent 3,000 years thinking about how to return to a galaxy that had forgotten them. They were met by nothing that looked like opposition. No fleet, no weapons platforms, no military response. They were met by a signal, Mara's signal. Encoded in their own language, in the structural vulnerabilities of their own encoding system, at a frequency that didn't disrupt communications, it disrupted navigation. Specifically, it disrupted the calibration of the gravitational reference arrays that vessels of that design relied on for precise transit in high-gravity corridors, which the outer relay corridor was. The vessels did not explode. They did not collide. They were not destroyed. They were redirected into a transit path that Cord's operational model had identified, and that Preeta Voss's guidance system had calculated, and that Mara's signal had initiated. A path that took them, with the smooth efficiency of a plan that had been running for 4 months, into the gravitational influence of a stellar body that the Assembly's navigational charts designated as a Class 3 stellar remnant, and that humanity had, in their own internal communications, been calling something else entirely. Something they'd been studying for 15 years. Something that had appeared in the materials science program's public documentation as a case study for thermal behavior in extreme environments. The 7 vessels went in. Nothing came out. Not because humanity had destroyed them. No weapon had been fired, no Class 7 designation triggered, no resolution violated. But because the stellar remnant was exactly what 15 years of study had suggested, and the gravitational mathematics were exactly what the computational modeling division had calculated, and the guidance was exactly what the thermal conductivity research had enabled, and the navigation disruption was exactly what Mara's signal had created. And all of it together was something that fit no assembly definition of a weapons system, because no one had written the definition to account for all of these things being the same thing. Vane Sarrett found Cord sitting in his small, windowless office 2 hours after the operation concluded. He was drinking coffee. He was writing in his journal. He looked tired. Not relieved, tired. There was a difference, and she had been around humans long enough to feel it. She sat across from him. She did not speak for a long time. "How long?" she finally said. "How long ago did you know it would come to this?" "I didn't know," he said, as he had said before. "I expected." "How long?" He turned a page in the journal. "A civilization doesn't remove relay infrastructure and frame a specific species for it without doing research first," he said. The framing was too accurate, specific to our propulsion signatures, specific to our behavioral patterns in contested situations, specific to how we respond to being suspected. That level of accuracy requires years of observation. He looked at her. They'd been watching us for a long time before the vote. Maybe they helped engineer the vote. You think they influenced the resolution? I think 217 civilizations reached the same conclusion about humanity in a very short period of time, he said. I think the data that supported that conclusion arrived through channels that were never fully audited. I think the threshold deviations that triggered the mandatory review process were calculated in a modeling framework that I cannot now find the source documentation for. He closed the journal. I think we were managed. I think the assembly was managed. And I think it worked almost perfectly. Almost, she said. He looked at her. Because you voted no, she said. Because you wrote things on paper. Because Mara Chen studied dead languages as a hobby. Because Preeta Voss showed the monitoring team rooms they hadn't asked to see. She stopped. Because you were waiting. We were preparing, he said. There's a difference. And if the preparation hadn't been enough, he picked up his coffee. He looked at it for a moment. Then we would have kept preparing, he said, with whatever was left. That's not, she stopped, started again. That's not a strategy. No, he agreed. It isn't. He set the coffee down. He opened the journal to the last page he'd written on, and she saw upside down that it was not notes, not analysis, not patterns, not operational data. It was a list of names. Human names, she thought, from the shapes of them, dozens of them. The people involved in the preparation, she said. The people who kept working, he said, when they were told their work didn't matter anymore. When they were told they were no longer trusted with the tools of their own defense. He touched the page briefly. This is who we are, not the weapons, not the capability, the people who kept working in the space between what they were allowed to do and what they understood needed doing. He looked up. You wanted to know what humans are planning. The answer is that we're always planning. Even especially when we have nothing left to plan with. The coffee cooled between them. The windowless room was quiet. Vane Sarrett thought about all the reports, all the sessions, all the behavioral models that kept returning error codes and insufficient data flags and recommendations for further study. She thought about 47 monitoring team reports trying to locate the boundary of human compliance and never quite finding it. She thought about the vote 217 to 1 and what she had assumed that ratio meant. We thought stripping your weapons would reduce you, she said. Cord looked at her for a long moment. Counselor Vane Sarrett, he said, we are not our weapons. The way he said it was not angry, not triumphant, not even particularly emphatic. It was the way you state something that has been true for so long it has passed beyond argument into something more like geography, a feature of the world rather than a position in a debate. We made the weapons, he said. We will make others if we must, and others after that. We will work with whatever we have. We will find the spaces. We will wait as long as we need to wait, prepare as long as we need to prepare, sacrifice what we need to sacrifice. He closed the journal. You can strip us of everything the resolution names. You can strip us of everything it forgot to name. You cannot strip us of the understanding that we have survived things before, and that surviving them required us to continue past every point where stopping would have been logical. Vane Sarrett sat with that. Outside the windowless room, the assembly was reconvening. Reports were being filed. Resolutions were being drafted. The behavioral modeling institutes were commissioning a new study. Somewhere, someone was writing a document about what had happened in the outer transit corridor, and in that document, they were choosing words very carefully, because the words you chose determined what you had to surrender and what you were allowed to keep. The galaxy was a very old place. It had seen species rise and fall and conclude, and it now knew, sometimes return. It had voted and negotiated and drawn lines and defined terms. It had built an assembly and written resolutions and tried, in its careful, comprehensive, multi-civilizational way, to make the universe governable. And humanity had sat in its small, windowless office, in its chair that didn't fit, drinking its bitter coffee, writing in its inaccessible notebook, waiting for everyone to run out of comfortable options. Not because they were the strongest, not because they were chosen, not because the galaxy owed them anything or destiny had pointed in their direction, but because somewhere deep in whatever humans were made of, beneath the weapons and the words and the treaties and the compliance documents, there was something that did not recognize finality, something that looked at the word concluded and heard it as a question rather than an answer, something that, when told it had been reduced, began immediately and quietly calculating exactly how much it had been allowed to keep. The assembly would debate what to do next for months. It would commission studies. It would revise the resolution and then revise the revision and discover that each new version of the language created new spaces between the words, and that the spaces were never empty and that they never would be. And Elias Cord would attend every session. He would sit in his chair. He would write in his journal. He would drink his coffee, bitter at first, then acclimated, and he would wait. Because in the end, that was what the galaxy had never learned to account for. Not what humanity could do when it had everything it needed, but what humanity chose to do when it had almost nothing left. The answer had not changed in all of recorded human history, and it did not change now, and it would not change in any future the galaxy's modeling institutes were capable of projecting. They would continue, not until they won, not until they were safe. Not until the math said the odds were favorable. They would continue until there was nothing left that could be called a reason to stop. And then, in the judgment of every rational civilization that had ever observed them, they would continue a little past that too.